that we'll talk about at the beginning. Okay, everyone, I think we'll get started now. Of course, this week's Parsha is, or Parshiot, we have Vayakhel Pekudei. It's a double Parsha. We have double Parshiot when there are fewer weeks in the year than there are Parshiot. So therefore, we have to have Parshiot doubled up. When we have a leap year, as I believe next year will be, so then we will have very few. We still have, but we'll have very few double Parshiot, because then we will have a commensurate number of Shabbatot to cover the number of Parshiot. This week's Parsha, as we said, or Parshiot, is Vayakhel Pekudei, and this Shabbat is special in that, first of all, it is, in addition to it being the double Parsha, it is also Shabbat Chazak, because Vayakhel and Pekudei conclude the reading of the Sefer, the public reading of the Sefer Shemot, and so therefore it is also Shabbat Chazak. In addition to that, this coming Shabbat is Shabbat HaChodesh, the week upon which we are enjoined to take note of the fact that the first month of the Jewish year, the exclusive Jewish national year, is Nisan, and that is always heralded with Shabbat HaChodesh, in which we read the very first mitzvah that was given to the Jewish people, the mitzvah of counting time. So those are three important elements: the double Parsha, Chazak, and Shabbat HaChodesh. And also the third thing is that, of course, we read, while we won't read the Haftarah of Machar Chodesh, Rosh Chodesh will begin. It is Shabbat Mevarchim on top of it. So we'll read, we will have Rosh Chodesh coming Saturday night. So we have a very full Shabbat. We take out 2 Sifrei Torah, and I'm going to try to tie everything a little bit together and talk a little bit about each of those elements, because they can be drawn together. First, of course, the most prominent aspect of the Kriyat HaTorah that we have is the reading of Parashat Vayakhel Pekudei. And they recount for us and record for us the actual implementation of the directions that Hashem gave to Moshe, and Moshe then gave to Bezalel, who was the, so to speak, we could say that he was the architect or the builder of the Mishkan itself. One of the questions we have to ask is, what's the nature of the creative person? What is it? Is that person a person who, through the sweat of his or her brow, and who, through hard work and determination, is capable of doing things, whether it's in the arts or whether it's in literature or whether it is in the sciences and mathematics? They work very, very hard, and because they're bright, very bright, they are capable of doing remarkable things. Or is it that the creative mind and the creative individual is actually endowed by God, even prenatally, destined, if you will, to be able to perform remarkable things in the areas of the arts and the sciences? For this, we're going to turn for a moment to the Ramban. The Ramban says to us that really, Bezalel, there was no reason for Bezalel to be able to do what he did with metalworks, gold, silver, brass, all the various different artistic work with materials, with metals, each one of those in and of itself is a trade. It's a profession. And says the Ramban, as pretty much only he can say, what was the history that would allow Bezalel to do this? Mud, working in the mud pits, pushing, doing all the work of enslavement that other people were. Where could he possibly have gotten the wherewithal to learn these very, very exacting trades? For this, the Ramban says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe Rabbeinu, the Medrash in its own way said in Parshat Kitisa that Hashem took Moshe Rabbeinu to Shemayim, and when he was in heaven, so God showed him the Sefer HaToldot. He showed him that from all of the generations of human beings, what would come, each of them from Adam all the way to the time of Moshe, at least, maybe further too, that this is their fate. This is what they will do. And that Bezalel was named Bezalel precisely because Hashem had designated for this task when the time would come. So from here we can see that at least in Bezalel's case, and maybe in the matter of all creative people, that this is a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, designated maybe even before they came into any sort of being in the womb. This is what God had in mind for them. That's what the Ramban says was Bezalel. Bezalel may have been, of course, endowed as well with very gifted hands, a very gifted eye to be able to see what will work. There's so much that is entailed in the building of anything, let alone the working with metals and all of the attention to detail. He had those gifts, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu endowed him from the time of creation, so to speak, to be able to perform this task in the desert. Which brings to mind another aspect, another element of the creative individual. I'd like to take us to Moshe Rabbeinu in the last chapter of all the Torah. The last chapter, at the very end of Devarim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in that chapter, refers to Moshe Rabbeinu with three titles. He was called Evid Hashem. He was called the servant of God. Moshe Evid Hashem. He was called as well Navi. God called him there, Lokam od Navi b'Yisrael, Moshe. Moshe was the Adon Kol HaNaviim. He was the greatest of all the Nevi'im, but in fact he was that. And then the Torah uses a third title, which is used regarding other people as well, Shmuel, others. But here the Torah calls him that. In other places, people called let's say, Shmuel, Isho Elokim. But here, HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself refers and gives a title to Moshe that he is Ish Elokim. What does that mean, to be an Ish Elokim? And why does Hashem depart at in the end, the very last chapter of the Torah? Why does he then depart from the normal way of telling us about biblical heroes, Moshe Rabbeinu being the most prominent among them? Normally, the Torah talks about actions. It does not give titles. We call Yosef Atzad. The Torah doesn't call him Yosef Atzad. We call Moshe Rabbeinu. The Torah never calls him Moshe Rabbeinu. And so we have Avram Avinu, all the titles of David HaMelech. We give titles to so many of our great ancestors, but the Torah really does not give titles. It gives, when the Torah gives titles, it's very sparing, very sparing. It might be a person's a king, so they're called Melech, but which does not necessarily say that their character is good or bad. So here, I'd like to say, and then bring this back to to our own Bezalel, the great craftsman, the artisan of the Mishkan. The truth is that there is a certain dialectic. Dialectic would be two forces that are pulling in different directions within a person. Each and every one of us is. And the most essential element of that is the issue of obedience versus creativity. Obedience versus creativity. First of all, we all know that when you're young, we're taught to be obedient as much as people could tell us. First of all, it makes life a lot easier for parents, for teachers, if children are obedient. Figuratively, we say, learning to color within the lines. So obedience is a prime element of the human condition. But there's another element too, and that is creativity, to be creative. We stress obedience, but we reward creativity. When you think about it in America, in Western society, it's not the obedient people who make very, very big money. It's the people who are, for better or for worse, oftentimes for worse, who are unchained, and they feel no sense of boundaries within them. They can say they can do what they want. Some of you may well remember that about, of course, Harold Washington was the first African-American mayor in the city of Chicago. And understandably, he was, like any human being, he had his faults. Every human being has their faults. But he was a larger-than-life character, both physically and in terms of his personality. Well, he died very suddenly of a heart attack after a number of years in office, and he was profoundly mourned by Chicagoans in general, and particularly in the African-American community, because he really gave them a great sense of pride. Sometime afterwards, a person who I guess we have to call an artist decided to depict the mayor in a very, very uncomplimentary way in women's negligees, etc. And that's his idea of art. It cut people to the core. Of course, the people who admired him so much, it cut them to the core. And not only that, that artistic bent that he had was accepted by the art museum here in Chicago, and they displayed it. And it caused extraordinary pain to many people. And of course, the argument was, you can't confine the artist. The artist has to be able to be free in what he does. Artistic expression. Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, when talking about Bezalel, talks about artistic expression. First of all, of course, we talked about the idea that he was endowed with this tremendous ability, and he used it well. Yeah, by the way, you can be endowed with ability and not use it either. It happens every day, probably more often than not. But Rav Hirsch writes, when the creation of the Mishkan was completed, what a project it was, and the joy that it brought to people, especially the people who worked on the project directly. So first Rav Hirsch says that Moshe looked over the whole completed work, and on the work, two things were imprinted. Asuota, they made it in every part, from the smallest to the greatest. The whole personality, the devotion, the voluntary enthusiasm, the power of accomplishment of the nation was expressed. And secondly, it was exactly as God had commanded. Exactly so, as God commanded, that's how they made it. That's Rav Hirsch, the first part of Hirsch. Then Rav Hirsch sets down a principle for Jewish artists, whether they are of the visual arts, literary arts, auditory arts. There is certainly, of course, great room within Judaism and among the Jewish people for artists, creative people. But listen, please, how Rav Hirsch describes the freedom and the creativity. He calls it free, joyful obedience. Free and joyful obedience. Okay? Remember, we started this discussion with the question of, which shall prevail within a person? Is it obedient? Would I want to be most remembered as an obedient person or as a creative person? I often ask that to students. And, it sometimes depends on the school and also, of course, the students as to what they prefer. Very good students and very good Jews can come to different conclusions, especially if they hadn't thought about that morning when they got up. But here's what Rav Hirsch says: this free, joyful obedience, this freedom in obedience and obedience in freedom, which fills one with a happy consciousness of one's own powers just by sinking one's own personality in complete subordination to God's will, is what forms the most essential sign that characterizes a human being as an Eved Hashem. So if Hirsch says to us, yes, there's no question that each of the artists and the artisans who worked on the Mishkan undoubtedly were people who were gifted. Their joy came in two ways. When they looked at the work, they could see their personality. Because remember, even the obedient servant can see his or her imprint upon the work that they do. So that gave them great joy. It says Rav Hirsch, perhaps even surpassing joy, came from the fact that with their pouring of all of their creative juices into the project, nevertheless, they were obedient. They had freedom within obedience and obedience within the freedom that they were given, the freedom of expression. So some of the things that pass today as art could never be. You don't need me to tell you that. But sadly, we in Western society hear on a constantly about the artist's need to express himself or herself. And while that is true, Rav Hirsch doesn't deny that, but he says it is that freedom to express which goes into the work within the obedience that is necessary to make the work truly an act of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now I'd like to come back to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was called, again, an Evid. Now, what is an Evid? An Evid is a person who does exactly what the master says to do. So, for example, if the master decides he wants a corned beef sandwich, just plain, thank you, on rye, and the Evid says, I love my master. I really love him. I'm going to get a corned beef sandwich with the works. I'm going to put on a mustard and because to show him how much I love him. He's no Evid. Might be a very fine person, but he's not an Evid. An Evid does not do anything on his own. What the Evid does is what the master's will is. That's an Evid. To the degree that we do that, that's the degree that we are a good Evid. Now, by the way, many years ago, this is the years are sort of accordioning up on me. It could have been 10 years ago, it could have been 25 years ago, but I do remember that I once invited a sofer to class to have my students see the work of a sofer. And I invited, of course, a very good sofer, and also, of course, a very generous person of his time. So he spent about an hour showing how to make the letters. He taught each of them a little bit how to make the letter, but he showed them the precision that was absolutely necessary, or the Sefer Torah is invalidated. It becomes puzzle. So at the end, I was very impressed with it. And after he left, I asked the students, so what do you think? They said, there's no room for him. Everything he does is it has to be this way, it has to be this way, it has to be that way. And that's it. You can't deviate at all. When it comes to being an Evid, that's exactly what's necessary. A sofer who's writing the words of Hashem Yisborach on parchment, each and every word, each and every letter, each and every tag that's there. That's right. There's no room for creativity. Personality, yes. And people who know Sifrei Torah can see, oh boy, I can tell, the skill of the sofer who engaged in the writing of this Sefer Torah. That's an Evid. Moshe Rabbeinu was called an Evid. But then Moshe Rabbeinu was also called Navi. That no Navi in all of Jewish history ever even approached Moshe Rabbeinu, let alone surpassed him in being a prophet. What is a prophet? The Gemara tells us that when it comes to prophecy, ein shnei neviim mitnabim b'signon echad. There are no two prophets prophesied exactly the same way. Each of them had a message. Each of them was uniquely created to be able to give that message not only to the people of his or her generation, but to generations 3,000 years later, that we can pick up a Sefer. I can pick up Haggai. I can pick up Malachi. I can pick up any of the Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu. I can pick them up and read them, and it resonates with me. That's something that would last 3,000 years. Is truly a remarkable thing. That's a form of creativity, and and their creativity wasn't that they did what they thought they wanted to do. Their creativity is in the way they were able to give to the people who were listening to him, who were being inspired by him, to give the inspiring message that Hashem wanted, but in the way that the Navi found. That's creativity. And that is freedom that is obedience within freedom. Now, so I would submit to you, we now have two of the three titles God gave to Moshe Rabbeinu. He was an Evid, did what HaKadosh, followed HaKadosh Baruch Hu's directions to the T, and he was a Navi. He was that creative force that transcended generations, even to this day, even to non-Jews. When a person knows when to be obedient and when to be creative, even though these two forces pull, they tug, we all can feel the tension between, but I want to do it this way, or I want to do it that way. The feeling of creativity and to be obedient when those forces are pulling. And yet, within Moshe Rabbeinu, they lived in perfect harmony. He knew when to be obedient, he knew when to be creative, and when a person has mastered the art, and it is an art, of knowing when to be creative and when to be obedient, that person is called Ish Elokim. So that is and now we come back now to Bezalel. That was Bezalel, of course, in a lesser form. That Bezalel, of course, was creative, but as Rav Hirsch said, he knew to be obedient. He knew that freedom is only a positive force if it's within the obedience of what a person was created to do, not just what he wants to. Now, that takes care of the Parsha itself, but the Parsha, not only is this, of course, Shabbos, but Shabbos is also mentioned in this double Parsha too. And we find actually interwoven over the course of two or three, maybe three or four, Parshiot, all the way from Teruma, Tetzaveh, Kitisa, Vayakhel, Pekudei, 5 Parshiot in a row, all in one form or another, dealing with the architecture of the Mishkan, or the furnishings of the Mishkan, or the creation of both. Right? So we have 5 Parshiot, but interspersed there, the message is Shabbat. Interspersed, the message is Shabbat. And in the Parsha of Vayakhel, again, they're Vayakhel, they're all gathered together, and they're probably looking to see, well, where are they going to put the Aron Kodesh, or where are they going to, no, that's not what they hear from Moshe Rabbeinu. They hear from Moshe Rabbeinu that Shabbos has to be observed. And of course, Chazal tell us the fact that the Parsha of Shabbat is mentioned within the creation of the Mishkan is to say that as important as the Mishkan is, Shabbat is even more important. Now, this last week, I had the pleasure of listening, as I do every week, listening to Rabbi Matanki's presentation, and one of them he quoted. I'm sorry that it eludes me who he quoted, but the idea is that Shabbat is not an interruption in our work week. It's not an interruption in the work. It is that which brings us closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so we can serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. It's not like all of a sudden you stop and then I'll pick it up. No, Shabbos is a tool for rejuvenation so that we can each week seem to spiral ourselves higher, and Shabbos becomes the catalyst to do that. Now, I want to share with you, while we're talking about Shabbos, a couple of things. First of all, the idea is that Shabbat, there was a book written many years ago by Abraham Joshua Heschel. It really affected my whole life thinking. He was a magnificent writer, and he wrote about the beauty of Shabbat and what it does for people. So I'd like to read for you just a short paragraph of his elegant quote, prose. He says, "The meaning of the Sabbath is to celebrate time rather than space. 6 days a week, we live under the tyranny of things, of space. On the Sabbath, we try to become attuned to the holiness in time. It is a day on which we are called upon to share in what is eternal in time, to turn from the results of creation to the mystery of creation, from the world of creation to the creation of the world." Just a truly inspirational paragraph. And so I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the sanctity of time and the sanctity of space in the couple of minutes that we have left. Of course, the Mishkan itself represents the sanctity of space. But the first mitzvah, the first time we ever have the word kadosh, is regarding Shabbat. At the very end of the Maaseh Bereshit, of the creation, the 6 days of creation, which are reminiscent, which the Mishkan is reminiscent of, the very same language in the creation of the Mishkan is also used in the creation, was used in the creation of Shabbat and the world. So there is a link, both in terms of what we may and may not do in creating the Mishkan, and also in terms of what sanctity is. Now, in all of Sefer Bereshit, the Shoresh, Kuf, Dalad Shin, Kadosh, in meaning, in this case, sanctity, only appears once. In all of Bereshit, you would think it'd be all over the place. Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, Eretz Yisrael, all of that, no, the word Kadosh is not mentioned there. It's only mentioned specifically regarding Shabbat. Now, that Shoresh of Kuf Dalet Shin is mentioned also in Bereshit, but not in the meaning of sanctity, almost the opposite of it. So this idea of Kadosh, the Torah is teaching us by the fact that Kadosh is isolated and it's only told to us by Shabbat, it tells us what is the Jewish view of Kedusha, what makes something Kadosh. Well, Shabbat, it's remarkable, of course. Shabbat sanctifies time, not space, even though the Mishkan sanctifies space. The other thing is that the Shabbat is a unit of time which you really is not determined by. You can't tell when Shabbat is just by. Let's say a person, God forbid, were ill, fell into some sort of deep sleep, 3 days, 4 days. when he or she woke up, they'd have no idea what day it was. They wouldn't know whether it's Thursday or Tuesday or Monday. So maybe the people around them might be dressed differently. Okay, but from the day itself, you can't tell. So the idea is that for Judaism, sanctity is that which is designated as sacred. That is Shabbat. Shabbat has sanctity only because HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave it sanctity. And therefore, we have to realize that as well, that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu, either in terms of time or space designates it, that's what makes it holy. Now, it's also worthy of noting that the word olam, we say Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam, and we usually say, blessed is God, sovereign of the universe, which is space, no? It's the universe, we consider it. Now, there's a lot of space in between, in between the material elements of the universe. But in the Torah and throughout Tanakh, olam never means space. It only means time. It has to do with eternity. Time represents eternity, not space. The Romans sanctified time as space, and the Greeks sanctified space. But all of that disappears. But time, the ability to have time, to use time, that in itself is what makes holiness. And the very first example of holiness was Shabbat. So I'll end with two very quick stories. One is, this isn't a story. Thoreau once said, he said, one cannot kill time without doing injury to eternity. That when we misuse time, so that in itself, and this is Thoreau, we're not talking about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, we're not talking about the Chofetz Chaim. We're talking even Thoreau, maybe perhaps specifically Thoreau, realized that time, we all go through life and we waste a lot of time. The last story, with that I'll close, is a very beautiful, somewhat famous story of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Now, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter lived in the 19th century. He was an extraordinary observer of nature, both physical nature and more specifically, human nature. And that's what allowed him to create this remarkable system that we call the Musar movement. It's not to tell us, as I've mentioned in the past, it's not to criticize us. Musar movement, Musar is self-discipline. So he wanted to teach people how they can discipline themselves. So one day he was walking, it was the middle of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and it was getting dark. Now, of course, there was no electricity at all in, where he lived, and there wasn't even in Western society. And he comes across, he needed his shoes to be fixed, so he brings his shoes to a cobbler, to a person who's working, and as it's getting darker, the cobbler takes the shoes, and Rabbi Salanter said, "Are you going to have time to be able to fix the shoes?" And the cobbler said to him, "Wie lang as the lichtike brennt, ken men arbeit." As long as the candle is burning, we have time to work. And Rabbi Yisrael, of course, who now could expand that simple concept to become an eternal truth, that as long as the fire of the neshama exists within us, we can still work. We can still work on ourselves. We can still work upon being better. Wie lang as the lichtele brennt, as long as the light is within us, we can work. And that then becomes one of the most beautiful messages, sanctification of time, and of course, by extension then, through the Mishkan, the sanctification of space. B'yirtzeh Hashem, next week we'll be able to meet again. Next week will be Parashat Vayikra. Okay, so I want to wish everybody Shabbat Shalom and have a wonderful week. And B'yirtzeh Hashem will see some of you directly, and soon we'll look at each other directly.
Fantastic.
All right.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank
Shalom,
you.
Yishkar.
Shalom, everybody. My pleasure, Glenn. I got your message, Glenn. Thank you.